Alrighty, mighty. Let us get in Craig and let us have a look at what this conversation is around this coalition government spending more than it pledged. From the CTU, Economist Craig Renney. Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
How you doing? Doing well?
I'm good. It's been a big day here. It's the third most important day of the year after the two budget statements.
Yeah.
Obviously, my son's birthday, obviously being number one on that list. He said rapidly rescuing that particular sentence. It's been a really big day, and it's been a really interesting day here in Wellington to actually find out what's really going on with the government accounts, because these are the audited accounts. So these are actually what's really happened rather than our guesses at any one point in time.
Cool. Let me introduce you to Emily as well. She's someone who's doing some stuff with us. Emily. Is part of the whānau. So here's what we'll do, because one of the questions is, what the hell is today all about? You've kind of already answered that. Let's have a look at the story off One News, and then let's have a talk to what is actually going on, what we need to know, etc., etc. So this is from One News tonight.
All right, to other news now. And despite the promises, the coalition government is spending more than it pledged. That's the takeaway after the government's books were opened. The finance minister admitted it's sobering reading. The books remain in the red, with the country's deficit now almost $13 billion. Revenue is up, but it's not enough to close the gap. Debt has gone up by nearly $20 billion to $175 billion, taking it to 42.5% of GDP.
I was actually thinking as we go through, Craig, should we stop and do you want to just speak to these as we're going through? So it's gone up by, how much did it say, another $45 billion?
So debt went up by $20 billion.
Right.
Debt has risen to 40, as it says in the graphic, 42.5% of GDP. Now that sounds like a lot of money, and it is. However, if we were having this same conversation in the UK, that figure would be 100%.
Wow. So their debt is 100% of their GDP?
Correct. If we were having this conversation in the US, the debt figure would be somewhere in the order of 125, 130% GDP.
Yeah.
If we're having a conversation in Japan, that debt figure will be 270% GDP. So it's very much a case of it's high by New Zealand standards, or it's higher by New Zealand standards, but New Zealand standards are very, very low. We don't have a debt crisis in New Zealand. We have lots of other crises. We have a crisis of investment, we have a crisis of infrastructure, a crisis of confidence in this government, but we don't have a public debt crisis. There's no suggestion that our debt problems are any issue at all.
Yeah. Okay. So answer me this then. We're at 42.5% of GDP. You're saying that's a pretty good result. What are some countries that are a better result than us? Are there many that are also like 40%, 30%, 35%, 20%?
No, I mean, even Australia has a higher debt to GDP ratio than us. The countries that tend to have lower debt to GDP ratios are countries which have historically had, like Switzerland. That there are some countries that have very low debt to GDP ratios because in the past they've been burned by debt, and so they make a thing of reducing debt to GDP ratios. Then there are some jurisdictions that have very low debt to GDP ratios. I'm sort of thinking here, Niger, Chad, Sudan, which have lower debt to GDP ratios simply because nobody will lend them any money.
You're right.
So it's a real it's a real mixed bag. But New Zealand's debt is absolutely the problem, and that's reflected in the fact that during COVID, the Crown's credit rating went up. We're one of the only countries in the world where people were more keen to lend to us during COVID than anywhere else in the world.
Hang on. So we got better. Gee, thanks, Jacinda. Isn't that what we're supposed to say at the end of that? Something like that?
Yeah. We're one of the few countries in the world that was the best. Yeah. Speaking
of that, though, $20 billion more debt under this government. My understanding is under John Key's government, debt went up by approximately $50 billion. Under Labor, approximately $25 billion, far less than under John Key, funnily enough. But Labor seems to get the lion's share of them the country being put into debt by a certain sector. And these guys are already taken up by $20 billion. So that means they're at a similar level to what Labor did in their full term with COVID. Is that correct-ish?
Well, so Nicola, or Miss Willis rather, would say that some of these accounts reflect the first few months or the last few months of Labour government. So
Okay.
she would say that not the full year for her. To be frank, it's good practice amongst economists when we're talking about debt, particularly public debt, to actually not talk about the nominal figure, so the 175 or the 150 billion, because it's actually a fairly meaningless figure. You should always concentrate on the debt to GDP figure. And again, our debt to GDP figure isn't a big issue. It rose last year, didn't rise a huge amount, and there's still a huge amount of headroom should we need to borrow more money in case of a natural disaster or something else.
It actually, when you say it's pretty good. When you say comparing to, say, for example, our counterparts, the Americas, the Australias, the UKs, it's pretty fucking awesome, to be honest.
Yep. So if you compare ourselves to countries like Canada, where that figure will be much higher, it's 60-odd%. If you compare yourself to the UK, to the US, it's higher in Germany, which has had a historically stronger economy for a really long period of time. If we're having this conversation in Italy, it would be somewhere in the order of 150, 160%
Wow.
GDP. It's actually more important who you owe the money to, rather than actually the amount of money. Because if you
Who do
owe
we
the
owe the
money
money to?
well, we generally speaking owe the money to international money markets, which is generally speaking big Australian banks, because they're wrapped up in investment portfolios. We owe some money in euro markets and some money in Japan, but not enormous amounts. Italy has a very high debt to GDP ratio, but most of its debt is owed to Italians. So it basically owes it to itself. It's a much more stable form of debt than if all of your debt is owned by foreigners and they demand that debt in their own currency. All New Zealand debt is denominated in its own currency, and so therefore we're not likely to default on our debt.
I love it that we've played 25 seconds of the video and we've spoken for 5 minutes so far. That feels very BHN. Emily, do you want to ask anything from your worldview at the moment? Me and Emily had a bit of a chat before and she goes like, no, the economy is not my strong suit, but lots of people, economy is not what they understand. Is there anything from your perspective that we're going to keep going with the video as well, but that you want to ask of Craig?
I think you've answered most of the questions that I had. And the things I was looking up was trying to figure out what the whole debt ratio thing is, or what it actually looks like, that 42%, and then looking at other countries and seeing how high it is. What would you start to freak out about? Like if you saw it jump up to 20% in a year, would that freak you out? Or what's scary?
It's what are you spending it on?
Yeah.
So if it rose 20% in a year because there was a natural disaster, or because we suddenly had a global pandemic, or because we suddenly had to, find money to pay for social services in our place overnight, you'd buy that. That's not a problem. It's if you spend it and you don't have anything for it, you don't get anything for it. That's when it becomes a real problem.
All right, let's keep going with this story, see if we can get past 30-second mark before we stop it again and start talking.
The government says the figures justify the cuts it's made, but as business correspondent Katie Bradford reports, those affected by the cuts disagree.
In Porirua and in Warkworth, groups that help the most vulnerable are reeling after learning their Oranga Tamariki funding will be slashed.
Very surprised and very disappointed. People come to the parenting course because they want to. They want to become better parents, and we've even got grandparents who are parenting their grandchild or children.
A lot of the work we're doing is preventative mental health work and even moderate mental health work, and the rug's been pulled out from under all of those people.
So they'll have to find money elsewhere.
We're competing with an awful lot of people at the moment, and everybody knows that charities at the moment are really struggling.
What it really means is that families and young people who need support don't get the support that they need.
We will look at this a bit later on as well, because we talked a bit about the Gumboot Friday last night. And a bunch of these charities seem to be struggling. I don't know if literally these charities, but there are a bunch of charities out there now who seem to be struggling based on what looks like Nationals, Labor bad, political movement to just commit $24 million to one group before due process is even solved. So we're seeing that in some sectors. Whether it's this sector or not, I'm not sure. But a bit later on tonight, we might have another a re-look at that as well, Emily. We'll keep going. Here comes the English graduate.
Will these programs help the victims of the government's cost-cutting drive?
What the books today tell us is it's now a time for very careful choices.
Those books make for grim reading for a government that promised to cut spending. Treasury's tally shows spending up 11% and revenue up 9%. Soaring costs at ACC and Health NZ make up a large part of the uptick in spending.
We need to impose restraint to ensure that the government and the country is living within its means.
Unemployment is expected to keep rising, the Finance Minister admitting that could hurt the government's future tax take and increase welfare costs.
You have asked government departments to make cuts that have led to some of those job losses. Therefore, some of that extra money that will cost the system does come down to your decisions.
No, I don't accept that because...
Of course I don't. Craig, do you accept that out of interest?
Yes. But it's just maths. You lay off 7,000 workers or so, or at least you stop the employment of 7,000 people. Some of those will be vacancies, but you lay off 7,000 people. You're going to be increasing the number of people who claim unemployment benefit, the number of people who claim accommodation supplement, the number of people who need assistance in other ways. Unemployment has already risen 47,000 this year. So at least part of that is the Crown. It's also partly the Crown because it's stopped other government programs. Those have flow-on effects for other employees in particular areas. They've stopped investments in infrastructure, be it the IREX program, be it Dunedin Hospital. Again, that's flow-on effects in terms of infrastructure and employment. So by definition, some of the government's decisions will be leading to higher unemployment right now, and what seems likely is higher unemployment in the future.
I believe they said revenue's up 9%, but expenditure's up 11%. Now, when I think about that from, bit of a moron's point of view, I think about tax cuts and landlords as well. Because if they didn't give that away, revenue would be up even higher. And it feels like what these guys are doing, to coin a phrase, that they've bought the Ferrari, right? And then they've done their sums and realised there's nothing left to pay for the groceries in the house. And they've gone, look, we just don't have enough money for groceries. And you're going, but you bought a Ferrari. And they're like, well, we've got no groceries, no money left for groceries. So we got to cut ourselves down a bit more because we don't have enough money for groceries, whilst they've got a Ferrari sitting in the driveway. It feels like that a bit to do with the tax cuts and the landlords. It's like, but you're short of money, but you gave 17 billion away. No, the budget at the moment, is that a fair way to think? Well, not fair as in yay fair, but am I being fair describing it like that?
I think perhaps we might describe it in economics as it's about choices. And the government's making choices to not fund things. The government's making choices to not do things. And it doesn't need to make that choice. If I give you a silly example, if we were to spend an extra $10 million and it would lead to happiness breaking out across Aotearoa, to sun shining, birds singing, everyone being happy, would you spend that money? Of course.
Yeah.
But if you set a debt limit and that $10 million was just above that debt limit, would you still spend that money? Yes, of course you would. You'd be mad not to. You've got an artificial debt limit. What we're finding here is that the government has set itself a fiscal strategy, but it hasn't thought through the consequences of all of the cuts that it's then delivering. So it's going to achieve its fiscal strategy, come what may. It's going to achieve the numbers it wants to achieve, but it doesn't mind the losses on the way through, or it hasn't thought through the losses on the way through. In essence, it knows the cost of everything, but it doesn't know the value of the things.
And some may like to debate, maybe they have thought it through, and maybe there's a plan for things falling over, and maybe they've got someone in one of those back rooms that no longer has working, just waiting to come to the front room to take over some of these places where the losses are happening. And I mean, you put someone in charge of the health system who has a record in private healthcare, just maybe they do know, Craig. Maybe they're completely aware of what they're doing. Maybe it's a part of their plan.
Well, I think one of the things I would say is that if there is a plan, they're delivering it very badly because debt's continuing to rise, spending is continuing to rise. And if their plan is to reduce those things so that they've got more space in future, or to make services so bad that they then look to privatize them, they look to move them into the private sector, then what's happening right now is you've got 35,000 people on the streets of your good city telling them to get lost.
Yeah.
And I think that's just a foretaste of what's likely to happen if we see much more of a push in that particular direction.
All right, let's try and get to the end of this article. I'll try and hold my tongue for the rest of the video.
Extra money that will cost the system does come down to your decisions.
No, I don't accept that, because there's two things going on there. The first is no government can continue to live beyond its means indefinitely. And the second is that what we're concerned about is the number of...
Oh, it's very hard for me not to stop this video. I want to keep talking, but I'm going to do my best.
...jobs and the economy as a whole.
Labor says it shows the coalition's tax cuts were unaffordable.
New Zealanders will continue to pay the price for those tax cuts well into the future, and it means that New Zealanders should be bracing for more public sector cuts, more public service cuts.
Nicola Willis says it's all about priorities.
If you cut the funds to organisations working with our most vulnerable people in our communities, it's a weird thing to do.
It's hard to see any rationale.
The government says it's the plan it promised and the plan it's sticking to.
And Katie, you've just had some...
That'll be the wrap up for that one. Emily, I've talked a lot. Anything you want to jump in with now, and any questions you've got?
Actually, I was thinking about your analogy of buying a Ferrari, and I was thinking about it before. It's a little bit different because they've basically cut their revenue stream by giving back money to cut the taxes they would usually get from landlords and from people, right? So they've cut their revenue. So it would be actually more like you've reduced your hours at work for whatever reason, and then you've gone, I don't have enough money, so I'm going to borrow it instead. Is that kind of a better analogy, Craig?
Well, certainly the Crown's reduced its revenue. Now, it's fair to say the cuts in the revenue only start in April this year, because that's when tax cuts started to bleed through. And so actually only a small part of the tax cuts have actually come through in this set of accounts. The next set of accounts, the next year's accounts, will show the really big falls in revenue as a consequence of the tax cuts. What this also shows is that some of the revenue we thought was going to turn up hasn't turned up, and that's because the economy isn't doing so well. So corporate tax fell 5%. We spent 17% more this year on unemployment benefits than we did last year. We spent 8% overall on more benefits than we did last year. So we're seeing the impacts of that slowdown in the economy. We're seeing the impacts of fewer people spending any money. GST receipts rose 4.1%. Great. But actually, that's less than the inflation during the majority of that period of time. So again, it suggests that there's a really slow economy. Things aren't going so well. And the reason those things are important is because the accounts are telling us there's no engine of growth. The government isn't investing. We see net investment fall every year for the forecast period in the government's accounts. The private sector isn't investing. It's not growing. We're seeing unemployment rise. So consumers aren't going to be investing. So where is this magic growth going to come from, which will create the tax, which will create the revenue that we need to deliver the public services? We can't keep cutting our way to try and find, you end up in this vicious spiral of cut, things get worse, so you cut, so things get worse, so you cut.
Yeah.
Instead, you actually need to do what has been textbook economics for 70, 80 years, which is when the economy is in a state, when things aren't going so well, the Crown intervenes because it's got much deeper pockets to reduce the impacts of that fall, to make sure people stay in work so that when the recovery does turn up, you get a much better recovery rather than much deeper scarring that occurs if you leave it alone. And that's been the experience in the country that I'm from, the UK, where post the GFC, we did exactly that. We went for austerity, we cut public services left, right, and centre, and it took a decade to get out of that mistake. I don't want to see us repeat that mistake here. We really need to change our approach to how we're dealing with the current crisis, which on a GDP per capita basis is actually worse than the GFC rate.
Nicola Willis said in that conversation, quote, "What the books today tell us," end quote. I'm interested because what they're doing a little bit is going, "Oh my God, have you seen the books? They're so bad." But they had pre-fu, then they had a budget, and now the books are opened again. Are they really? Is this now a little bit like they're going to go, maybe this will be the last time we can say blame Labor because the next budget's all us? Because it feels like, you know, they've written out all these checks all year, and then they've flicked back through the stubs on their old checkbook. I'm a very old person, people watching, and going, "Oh my God, look how much I've spent!" Like they seem surprised, but shouldn't they pretty much know what the books are going to tell them today?
Well, we have fantastically open books in New Zealand. We're amongst the best place in the world in terms of the transparency of our public accounts. Again, if this was the UK, we could only dream of the level of transparency and that New Zealand has. Huge, overwhelming volumes of information about public expenditure. So none of this should be a surprise. And interestingly, if we go back to the accounts that were forecast in September last year, just before the election, the result that we have now is pretty much the result that was forecast in September.
Right.
So despite all the claims of cutting back, being more sensible, and managing prudently, books are what they were predicted to be before we even had a change in government. So there doesn't seem to have been a huge amount of change what's going on. I just want to tell you one thing, Pat, just to give you just slightly depress you.
Oh, thanks.
That's why I'm Economist. I was born in 1979 in the UK, and the first election I could vote in was 1997. That saw Tony Blair being elected. That entire 18-year period was under a Conservative government.
Mm-hmm.
6 months before the election to have elected Tony Blair, the Conservative government was still blaming the Labour government of 1979 for the protest at that point. So I don't think any government's ever going to turn around and not use the previous government as an excuse for what it needs to do.
I think we need to put something in writing. You've got 12 months, not a second longer. Awesome. Thanks for coming on tonight, Craig. Emily, is there anything you want to ask before we wrap up?
Just a quick question on the prediction. Was that prediction based on the government at the time, or was it sort of a prediction on what National said they were going to do?
No, based upon the government of the time.
So it's based on what they're currently spending.
It was based on the forecast in September of last year was based upon the settings of the previous Labour government, and that's actually what's come to pass. Instead, the new national government came in and said it was going to make things better, but actually things are pretty much as forecast way back in September. Now, one thing I would say is this: is that these are all backwards-looking issues. Right, we're all looking back and saying what happened. The key challenge is actually what's in front of us. What can we do? And we have lots of choices about what we can do. We've got huge infrastructure investment opportunities in front of us that we could choose to make, and we have the debt ceiling to deliver them. We could choose to tackle child poverty and to put food in schools, and we could choose to take away the tax credits that we're giving for tobacco. We could choose to actually make investments in the country so that we're all better off, so we don't have a health service that's going to be forced to save 7% of its budget just this year so that it can balance its books. We could do all of those things, and those things are in the future, right? Instead, we look likely, and the Minister of Finance committed to this in the speech today, to cut every year from this point forward so that they can deliver on their targets. So what we've seen to date is just a foretaste of what's to come over the next few years. But the good thing is, other choices are possible. This thing isn't inevitable. It's not like coastal erosion. It's not just going to happen. We can choose to do things differently, right? And I say this most times I come on here, so forgive me, Pat. We have 720 days, roughly speaking, until the next election. We've got to spend every single day telling the public that not only there is a better future, that actually it's possible and preferable.
Thanks for coming on. That last bit of that question that Emily just asked, what I'm actually hearing you saying is this government has done nothing to impact where we're going, better or worse. So all the people that thought that this government was going to come along and change everything, you didn't get that. And the whole bloviating about we're going to do it so much better, the economy is doing exactly what was predicted to do. So they've literally made zero impact, other than to people's, like big picture, they've made zero impact. Down on the base level, lots of people are hurting more because of the austerity they're going through. But you're saying they could have made other choices and still been in the same place as well.
Well, if we look at the US, for example, inflation in the US is 2.2%. It's putting on record numbers of jobs. Its economy is growing at a real clip. It's got challenges, don't get me wrong. There are plenty of places that really struggle, right? But it's doing so much better than New Zealand. And the reason it's doing that, the Inflation Reduction Act, which invested trillions of dollars in new US infrastructure, a government that's being active in supporting labour markets. This is the US, not New Zealand, the home of hyper-capitalism, and it's doing so much better because it's doing the things actually we're taking away. And that's the real lesson for us, is actually, if we didn't take those things away, our recession is going to be more protracted and more difficult to get out of than it needs to be, and will be in those countries that do the things like the US, like the UK is starting to do, that we're actually going to see better outcomes there. But those choices are still in front of us. We could still choose to do that. We've just got to choose to do something different.
Kia ora, Craig, for being with us. Lots of people want to say kia ora, Craig. I really appreciate your clarity. That's from Ian. Bill says, Craig Renney is a champion. It's about making the right choices for all citizens, not just some. That's from Bill. And I think you've kind of already answered this, but there is one question in particular, which I'm trying to now find, which I can. There it is. Question for Craig: has our economy stagnated? Which is, I think you've kind of already answered that, but just in 30 seconds or less for Kiwibird.
Yes. Hello, Kiwibird. Yes, is the honest answer. The Reserve Bank forecasts the economy sort of basically not doing a great deal for the next few quarters. We don't see growth return. We might see a little bit more growth returning with the interest rates falling quite so quickly, but for many people, they're not going to feel that growth. So we see economic growth, but it doesn't actually make any difference to you, me, or other people on the street. And that's the real challenge. How can we deliver growth that puts more money in workers' pockets and actually makes them feel better off and make them feel more secure? And it's a different show to talk about how we do that.
As always, Craig, thank you for being available. We love having you on. The next time you come on, I want to see you in a T-shirt. I just get the sense that, you got to the end of your work day, you got out of your work clothes, and then you put them back on to come and talk to us. That's the sense I get. I could be wrong. So next time, a T-shirt and yeah, just saying, just putting it out there.
Thanks very much.